My name is David Brenner. I'm one of the three members of this team. Brad Chen and Mary Biggs Henson, who are the other two members from respectively University Press, Evangelical Chinese Church, and Damascus International Baptist Church, who have pulled together these three forums working with our pastors. So these forums are an opportunity to consider background context for the work that's being done in our Bible studies and in the sermons around the walls of separation that have characterized our congregations here in Seattle for good and for not so good reasons. And tonight we're going to be talking about the history of Seattle and also of Ephesus, where the Apostle Paul addressed the Ephesians in his letter. That's the scriptural background for our Kindred Forum work. With the help of two distinguished historians from the University of Washington, Professor Quintard Taylor and Professor Connie So, and with Reverend Earl Palmer, who needs no introduction to most of you, our pastor emeritus here at UPC. And Earl's going to be talking about Ephesus, and Professor Taylor and Professor So about Seattle through the lens of the ethnic communities that they are experts in as historians here in Seattle. They'll be our first panel tonight. Our second panel will be representatives of each of these churches talking about their own experiences that relate to the history as far back as the minds of man go, which may not be that far back, but to bring this home to the experience of members of each of our churches. And then Pastor Aaron Williams will lead us in an exercise in thanksgiving for the good and lament for the challenges, the difficult reasons that have created these walls of separation, and that will be our evening. We'll take a 10-minute break at 8 o'clock when we'll have cookies. So there you have something extra to look forward to. So I was a history major in college, but I'm certainly not in the league of our panelists. Nevertheless, I will attempt to give you a very short walkthrough of the sort of white history of Seattle that we mainly hear about when you go to the Underground Seattle Tour, for example. And I'll attempt to do this very quickly. We have a timeline that we've handed out, and let's go to that on the screen. And this timeline, first of all, the people who are not here, there are quite a few different groups, starting especially with the Native Americans who were present in Seattle in 1851 when the Denny Party arrived. So we're not telling the story through their lens. And there are other ethnic groups in Seattle whose lens we're not using either. But we're using the lenses of these ethnic groups because that's who our churches mainly represent. So, of course, this is not the whole story. If you read a sort of standard history of Seattle, it'll start with the Denny Party arriving in 1851. Who were the Dennys? They were Methodists mainly. They were progressives. They would have been Republicans if that party already existed, which it did then a few years later. They were what I would call practical progressives. They were abolitionists. This was a free territory. And they set a tone of basic decency in this new town that they planned. This town grew slowly for quite a while. It was basically a logging and coal mining and trade town. White settlers came from all over, especially Scandinavia, it now feels like, although it was actually a very diverse group of people. A lot of coal miners from all over the world because coal was a big deal in addition to logging. Non-whites only showed up really as punctuation points in this history from the settlers' point of view. After some brief hostilities, the Native Americans who occupied the region gradually faded into the background, leaving behind the name of their chief, Seattle. After the first railroad was completed with the help of imported Chinese laborers, a mob threw the Chinese out of Seattle when the Chinese began to compete for other jobs. Other ethnic groups arrived, but never in numbers sufficient to cause concerns that were unique to Seattle. At least, now I'm only telling this through this lens of common sort of white history. There was a big fire in 1891, after which Seattle rebuilt in stone and with better plumbing. That's a big part of the Underground Seattle tour, if you've ever taken it. There was a gold rush in 1897, as a result of which Seattle doubled and then tripled in size. There was a big World's Fair in 1909 on the grounds of the newly relocated University of Washington. Seattle seesawed back and forth between this wide-open town, which created the name Skid Road, with its many saloons and brothels, and a respectable group of civic and progressive leaders like the Reverend Mark Matthews of First Presbyterian Church. In 1915, First Presbyterian Church was one of the largest congregations in the country, 10,000 people. It had the first radio program of any church in the country, and Mark Matthews was a force. He started over 15 churches, and one of those churches was University Presbyterian, which started, as we know who were here in the centennial in 2006, as a Sunday school class in a store over on the avenue right after the university was relocated out here. Seattle became a very strong union town. How many people have heard of the Wobblies? The International Workers of the World, a socialist union. Seattle was a can-do town. It sluiced its hills down into the Sound. It created airplanes. It became a major shipbuilding and airplane manufacturing capital. But then bad things happened to minorities, more punctuation points in the white history in this period between World War I and II. On the one hand, World War I and II created some employment opportunities for minorities in shipbuilding and other industries, but on the other hand, and then again in World War II in airplane manufacturing. But on the other hand, during that period, immigration bans were imposed, especially on Asian immigration. Property ownership was restricted with new restrictive covenants that were added to people's deeds. And Japanese citizens were interned during World War II, most famously, and many of them lost all their property. The boys in the boat won the gold medal in the 1936 Olympics. We all know that now. 2 U.S. senators, Maggie and Scoop, sent boatloads of federal money to Seattle, making the University of Washington one of the biggest research public universities in the country. Seattle built the Space Needle, and Elvis showed up for the World's Fair. Everything was going great in the 60s until the supersonic transport fell through and Boeing laid off half its workforce, and somebody almost had to turn out the lights. But then, fortunately, a couple of young guys in high school started fiddling around with computers at the University of Washington. They never finished college, but they did start a company, and it did pretty well. And then another guy imagined a $5 cup of coffee might sell, and some other guys thought up grunge music, and somebody else figured out how to sell books on the internet, and Seattle boomed again. Our population did become more diverse. After the Vietnam War, a lot of refugees from Southeast Asia showed up. Seattle had its first black mayor, and Washington its first Asian governor, and we patted ourselves on the back for still being those pragmatic progressives. But the only people who can afford to live here are those who bought houses before 1990, and those were mainly white people who had had the wherewithal and liberty to do so. Minorities and poor whites had to move further and further out of the central city. That brings us to our real historians, Professor Taylor and Professor So. Professor Taylor is one of the foremost historians of the Black experience in the West. He's authored a notable history of the Central District in Seattle. For many years, he occupied the Bullitt Chair for American History at the U. And Professor So is a principal lecturer in the American Ethnic Studies Department at the U. She immigrated from Hong Kong with her family at a young age and grew up on Beacon Hill. She graduated from the U and received her PhD from Berkeley, and I just learned, attended First Pres when Earl was pastor there. So that's cool. A little reunion right here. And Professor So is deeply familiar with the experience of Asian congregations in Seattle from her own personal experience, that of Asians, Pacific Islanders, and Asian Indians in Seattle. I've asked them each to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes about the main developments that shaped these communities in Seattle. And they've given me permission to hold up a 3-minute card when their time is approaching, because we have a lot to cover. So that's where we're heading now. Take it away, and let's learn more about the specifics of these communities, and then we'll turn to you, Earl.
Okay. I think I'm up first. Do you mind if I sit? You can hear me. You can hear me. We start at the beginning, and I'm just going to have to respond to David, and that's probably cut into my time. But one of the things that I think we need to do as we go through these slides, and I'm going to go through these slides very rapidly, is that we need to not put ourselves in silos. I know David talked about the white history of Seattle. Connie's going to talk about the Asian American history of Seattle. I'm talking about the black history of Seattle. Understand that all of these groups interacted all of the time. There was never a period when there was no contact or no interaction. Not all of it was good, but nonetheless, there was always interaction. So let's keep that in mind as we go through these slides, and we can elaborate on that in the question and answer session. We start at the beginning. As David said, Seattle was founded in 1851. By 1856, there were black people here. This is Seattle in 1866. You can see the University of Washington on the hill. The most prominent black person in Seattle in these early years was William Gross. Gross operated what some people call the first hotel, others the second hotel in the city of Seattle. Gross would eventually become one of the wealthiest people in Seattle. Oops, yeah. Oh boy, technical problems. Okay, here we go. This is a very quick slide showing the rise of the black population and the general population. Understand, there weren't a whole lot of people here of any race at that particular time, but the black population was particularly small. But therein lies the paradox. Because the black population was small, there was opportunity to some extent. Certainly there was social opportunity, that is, the opportunity to vote, the opportunity at that moment to live anywhere in Seattle, but there was something else that was percolating under the surface. And even though this slide says 1910 to 1941, it really discusses unemployment and employment dilemmas for Black Seattle then and to some extent right now. There were various groups that came to Seattle, various African-American groups. One of the most important was the Buffalo Soldiers, both in terms of the number of people who arrived in the city, but also in terms of their impact. And there's a paradoxical impact. I don't know if Connie's familiar with this. The Boxer Rebellion, which was an attempt by the Chinese college students and others to lead a revolt against imperialism. There were various nations, including the United States, that put down that revolt. Some of the people who were sent there were Buffalo soldiers or black soldiers from Fort Lawton. On the other hand, the first integrated coal mining union, and I like the fact that David mentioned this, the coal mining, because we all think of lumbering, but the first the first integrated coal mining union in the country was in Newcastle in 1896. And of course, they became the model for integrated major unions throughout the country. On the other hand, again, the paradox. There were, by the 1920s, there was increasing restrictions on African-American economic opportunity. There were ship stewards who comprised something like 30% of the African-American male population, and maids, black domestic servants who were something like, black women were something like 80% of the maid population of that time, and black women remained overwhelmingly in this category, at least until World War II. Because of the problems in employment especially, and to some extent in terms of housing, and you're going to see more of this in a minute, we see the rise of civil rights organizations, including the NAACP. This is the organization that, of course, across the country fights against racial discrimination. I emphasize Horace Caden. We don't have time to talk about him, but Letitia Graves in the column on the right is the woman who actually started or founded the NAACP. She was a hairdresser. And she was concerned about the Woodrow Wilson administration, ironically because the Woodrow Wilson administration seemed to be raising racial barriers in Washington, D.C., not unlike certain things going on right now. This is a scene that most people in progressive Seattle don't identify with. Yes, the Klan was here. And indeed, the Klan was very powerful in Seattle, and that's one of the reasons why the NAACP became so active. The genesis of the ghetto, the rise of black concentration in certain areas. Up until the 1920s, African Americans could live in any corner of the city that they could afford, and of course they did. But by the 1920s, for reasons that I hope we can get into in the question and answer session, and I don't know if this, I don't want to lose any, let's see, I hope this is the pointer. Nope, this is, well, anyway. You can see the dots in the middle of the city. That's the Central District. The Central District is emerging. It's not predominantly black at this point, but blacks are concentrated in that area, along with Asian Americans. This is why there was that concentration. This is not an accident. It's not because there were black people who wanted to live next to each other. There were restricted covenants. And those covenants began to emerge around 1905, and they would eventually cover the entire city up until they were called illegal in the 1950s and eventually outlawed completely in the 1960s. I want you to take a look at this chart. Can everybody read this? I want you to see how the restricted covenants worked. They were primarily against black people and Asian people, but you can see there are other groups on there as well. Look at Bellevue. I think Bellevue is so ironic because Bellevue is predominantly Asian today, isn't it? Or close. It certainly has the largest Asian American population. Bellevue doesn't?
Beacon Hill does.
Beacon Hill. Oh, okay. We can debate that.
No, I can show you.
Okay. Redlining in Seattle, FHA housing map. I don't know how many of you are familiar with redlining, but that's the government's effort to reinforce racial segregation. Restricted covenants were essentially private agreements between homeowners. Those agreements are going to be ratified, codified, essentially, by redlining, which was promoted by the federal government and particularly the FHA. Segregation always leads to what I call a paradox. On one hand, there are blacks who cannot live in certain areas of the city. On the other hand, the concentration of blacks allows for them to develop a unique culture, and that culture, in many instances, evolves out of the churches. This is First African Methodist Episcopal Church, founded in 1886. I think this building was first constructed around 1900 when it was essentially the edge of town. There were trees all around this, and nobody could understand why they would put the church on the edge of town. Well, it's no longer on the edge of town. And this is Mount Zion Baptist Church, founded in 1894. These were the two anchor churches. I don't know how many black churches there are in Seattle today, but these were the first two that were prominent at the time and continue to be prominent. Then in the 1940s, World War II, we see the migration to Seattle. That migration comes about because of Boeing. Boeing begins to hire a lot of people, although not at first African Americans. The African Americans have to fight for jobs at Boeing. You guys remember Dr. Seuss. You're old enough to remember Dr. Seuss. He was an interesting character, but one of the things he did was to point out the contradictions in terms of racial discrimination, and you can see it from this image. This is one of my favorite photographs, indeed, maybe my favorite photograph, and I know, David, I have to go quickly. This is a photograph of Rosie the River. These are the real Rosie the River. These are the women who, along with others, helped build the planes which bombed Germany and Europe and bombed Japan into submission and helped to win the war. They were considered crucial war workers, and yet, in some ways, they were discarded at the end of the conflict. I like this. This speaks for itself. And that's true, that for the first time, there was a significant increase in the number of work opportunities for African American women as a result of the war. I'll let you read this statement as well. In other words, there are changes coming about in a whole host of directions. The NAACP grows rapidly. It's headed by a white man named Reverend Fred Shorter. It grows from about 200 members to 1,500 members in the World War II years, and it begins to take on racial discrimination in a whole host of areas throughout the city and throughout the region, by the way. I'm going to jump forward to the 1960s. There are three major issues facing African Americans in the 1960s. One is employment discrimination. The other is school segregation, and we still live with the consequences of that school segregation to this day. But the third one was segregated housing. This comes out of the restrictive covenants, and even though the covenants go away, the discrimination patterns that were established continue. And of course, we see the rise of a civil rights movement. How many of you knew that there was a civil rights movement here in Seattle in the 1960s? There were approximately 1,000 demonstrations between 1960 and 1970. This is not Birmingham. This is not Montgomery. This is Seattle, Washington, as blacks and whites and Asians and Native Americans took to the streets to try to bring about racial justice for the entire community. These are some of the leaders. E. June Smith was one of the rare women leaders of the civil rights movement. She was a rare president of the NAACP. How many of you are familiar with Ed Pratt? Ed Pratt was assassinated because of his civil rights activity here in Seattle. Again, this is not somewhere else. This is right here in Seattle. Ed Pratt dies because he attempts to bring about change in Seattle. He's the guy in the middle. And of course, Reverend Samuel McKinney just died earlier this year, the legendary pastor at Mount Zion. I like this. Okay, maybe I'm among Presbyterians here, but but I like this sign, okay? And notice the crowd. There are a lot of people who were not people of color who were coming out to protest discrimination, particularly discrimination in housing, including Felicia Schoenfeld. I don't know very much about her, but read her statement. The decline of the ghetto, residential desegregation. It says segregation in Seattle, but desegregation. Look at Seattle and look at the concentration of black folks in 1960. Look at the concentration. There's still a concentration in the central area, and I guess that's the Rainier Valley. But look at the fact that black folks are living in Federal Way, including my ex-wife, but we won't get into that. and they're living in Snohomish County. They're all over. They're even in Mercer Island. Can you believe that? 6th largest black populations in Washington cities, 2010. You can see the growth of the Seattle suburbs. Look at Kent and Federal Way. They're actually larger. They have larger black populations than Spokane and Vancouver. And look at Lakewood, Tukwila, and Renton. I threw this collage in because David said, say something about the rise of the African immigrant population. I'll give you a quick statistic. And this is for the whole country. More Africans have arrived in the United States voluntarily since 1990 than came during the entire slave trade era. I want you to think about that. More Africans have arrived voluntarily since 1990 than came during the entire slave trade era. Now, obviously, those who came during the slave trade came when America was a much smaller population or had a much smaller population. So 1 in 5 people at the time of the American Revolution was black. 1 in 5. We've never had that, and we probably won't have that kind of percentage in the future. The paradox of suburbanization, gentrification. In other words, there are people who move to the suburbs because they want to, and that's good, but there are also people who move to the suburbs because they're being pushed out of the central district, the central area. I call it the Europeanization of American cities. If you guys are familiar with Europe, you know that the rich live in the middle of the city, and the suburbs are the places where the poor live. We are increasingly seeing that in Seattle. Finally, the national crisis imposes itself on us here in Seattle. This is Charlena Lyles. This demonstration, you see the demonstration in the lower left corner? That was a demonstration that marched in front of my house. I live in Sandpoint Way in Northeast Seattle. In other words, these are issues. This is a crisis that extends across the length and breadth of Seattle and the length and breadth of the entire country. But finally, I want to leave you with this slide, Evolving Seattle. What do I say about this? Well, I don't have to say anything about this. This is the future. This is what has happened into Seattle. And this direction is not going to be changed. It's not going to be rolled back by any administration, by any wall, by anything else. We've got to learn to live together, because if we don't, we will destroy ourselves. We will destroy each other. That's a quote not from me, but a quote from the mayor of Seattle in 1945. I'll turn it over to Professor So.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to stand up just because I always make my students do that, and I fidget a lot. I'm one of those kind of people. Okay, so, and you'll want to see kicking down below. But anyway, here's one thing I want to say about Asian Pacific Americans, and there are a lot of heroes, and Seattle actually is really exceptional compared to many cities. We're the first place to have an Asian American elected to the city council in a big city. That's Wing Luke. We're also the first Asian American governor of the state of Washington. And also in Seattle, we don't have time to get into this, but it has a lot to do with Yesler Terrace and how it developed and the desire to make it exactly even. Seattle also has the first female mayor. We're the ones who started reparations. There's a lot of things about Seattle in general, but I'm going to go ahead and give you the history that really includes a lot of people like Wing Luke, Ruby Chow, Gary Locke, and many others. They come from this history, and there are others. But I want people to know the descendants of the earlier people, including myself. I'm an immigrant, but I'm a descendant of those who came over 1850s. And we were separated, we're all immigrants because of exclusion laws. So let me go ahead and go through. You don't have a point here, and Quintar is absolutely right, but that is actually Asia and the Pacific Islands. When it becomes Pacific Islands, and there's right above Australia, there's a place that says Papua New Guinea, and there's New Guinea. That island is what separates Pacific Islands from Asia. And actually, the term we use is not Pacific Islands, it's Oceania. And Oceania embraces Aleutian Islands and Peru because of all the relations we have with one another. But that's another story. Again, Malayo-Polynesians, all that is part of Asia as well. Okay, goes Africa, goes toward the Pacific Islands. But I'm going to go ahead and split up this way. By the time we get to 1980s and then toward the 2000s, this is what becomes Asia. North Asia is the former Russia, or Soviet Union. East Asia is China, Japan, Korea. Central Asia is the area we used to call the Middle East. South Asia is the Indian subcontinent. Southeast Asia is Nepal all the way over to the Philippines and New Guinea. So we're talking about a lot of people. And whenever we're talking about, and also the largest group in Seattle is Chinese. In the United States, it's also Chinese, but not by a lot. Although 1 in every 4 person had been Chinese until the United States Census changed the terminology for what it means. You have to be at least 1/2 to claim Chinese now. Because actually, people think Asian people are really homogeneous. There's a lot of people with 1/4, 1/8, especially go to Pacific Islanders, many Mexicans and others. There's always been a heritage of diasporic people. So I want to go ahead and add that in. You're never going to have really correct statistics about this. There's not enough time to go through all Asian Pacific American history, and because we're dealing with, in the Seattle schools, there are 66 Asian groups. There's actually more in the world, but in the Seattle schools, there's 66 Asian groups. When you combine the Pacific Islands together with the Asians, there's over 100. So what I'm saying is there's no way we can get into all the different nuances and things that happen. And I really want to caution people. There are a lot of folks that come up to me and they say, are you Chinese or what? First of all, there are definitely a lot more people than just Chinese. Seattle historically had been more Japanese American than Chinese because of what happened historically. And I have to say, you guys, it's all the way down to 2000 census. 75% of the King County's Asian Americans lived in Beacon Hill. This is why I'm saying for sure it's Beacon Hill, okay? Okay, there's no doubt about it, okay. So anyway, I just went ahead and divided it this way because we don't have time to talk about everything. The first period, 1848 to 1965, and actually there was Chinese in Seattle as early as 1851. One guy, they passed a law that made him not be able to vote. He was just one person's houseboy, and they passed a law against this one guy. Anyway, first period, 1848 to 1965 is just discrimination and segregation. In fact, a lot of my students, and my husband's a lawyer too, when you take constitutional law, a lot of what you learn is going to be about Chinese history, Japanese history, because it's all about what makes someone an American. Property law is going to be a lot of Native Americans and Latinx because of obvious reasons, land deeds and such. But Asian Americans overall are the most legislated group because the law that was passed against Chinese gets passed against Japanese, gets passed off Filipino, and then your subsequent groups. Second period is 1965 to 1980, and the shift in terms of why there's a lot more people is really simple. Civil Rights Act begat the change in immigration law, the 1965 Immigration Act. And that's why we started having more people. And again, a lot of it is credited to the hardworking people led by African Americans, but joined by many others. Asian Americans, Seattle definitely was involved. It's Seattle, San Francisco, and to a lesser extent, Los Angeles. The reason why not Portland, Portland decided, and I'm going to get into this history quickly, why Asians came in. Instead of having Asians as exploited laborers, they went with the Finns. That's why we have Swedes and Norwegians up here. Finns and Danes lived in Beacon Hill, and they also lived in Portland area. So there's a little bit of that history there. Anyway, you guys, what happened in 65 and 1980, we have working class immigrants joining up with others. We have a second generation, beginnings of the middle class, and a lot of the anti-Asian laws were abolished really because of the civil rights movement. All the Asian Americans were also part of it. West Coast Asians, all except for Oregon, and we always say Oregon's a little different, right? Okay, so West Coast Asians participated in the civil rights movement, definitely. This is why we have Asian American studies. It is part of the Third World Strike that began at Cal State, San Francisco, now San Francisco State University. UW was definitely part of this. Many of my friends were part of that movement. So 1965 Immigration Act, the big thing it does, it allows Asians, Pacific Islanders to come to the US at the same rate as European Americans. That was not the case until 1965. The people that really came over were the Koreans, Indians, Filipinos, Hong Kong people, Taiwan, and then much later, not until 1976 did we really start having more Chinese. After the Vietnam War, we only recognized Southeast Asians as Vietnamese, Cambodian, Lao, but the Lao people who come over, a lot of them are actually Chinese tribes, including the Hmong, the Mien, the Lahu, and many other groups. Not enough time to go through this, so there's a lot of complexities involved. But the third period, 1989, we changed our visa to make it easier for international students to come over, to convert their visa into H-1B1. So we started having more upper income immigrants. The other thing, we have sponsorship. To sponsor someone, you need $50,000 per adult. For the day you sponsor until they finally arrive. My family came over through sponsorship of others. So back then it was like $3,000. It's nothing like it is now. And this is why we're saying people may start out pretty poor, but they're pretty well off, all things considered, compared to people back in the other country. So alien face, let me go ahead and say, these are 7 hostilities that all Asian Pacific Island Americans have in common. African Americans and Latinx share a lot of this too, but there's only one that's really different. All Asians went through prejudice. Everybody goes through economic discrimination. We all face physical violence. That's called the Tacoma method. When you round up Asians and you kick them out, this is why there is no Chinatown. That's like the few big cities where you have no Chinatown. And that's because Tacoma is one that created the Tacoma method that San Francisco, LA, everyone else uses. So to this day, this is why there is no Chinatown there. Okay, so this is a Tacoma method happening in Seattle in 1886. Political disenfranchisement, what does that mean? No right to vote. No right to vote, you guys, until 1952. Incarceration. Asian Americans, and a lot of my students talk about it still now, if we're not seen as model minority great students, then the opposite effect is we're the gangsters. And you guys think about people on TV. How come all the good Asians are the ones who don't hang around Asians? Right? And you guys, I would add for other groups too, but that's what you pretty much see. And the Asians who do hang around each other, they must be Chinatown gangsters, right? Social segregation. There's a lot of that went on. And again, there's nothing wrong with Asians living next to each other, but when it's forced, then it's very different. I'm going to go through that one. That's one we'll emphasize given the topic today. And then exclusion. This is the one that African Americans and Latinx didn't have. Exclusion, meaning people from this country cannot come over. And it specifically addressed Chinese, then Japanese, then Filipino, it just goes on. So not enough time to go through all that, but let me go ahead and say that the reason why Chinese were encouraged to come to America has to do with Opium War, and that's because of trade imbalance. And they found a product in the West, and U.S. were junior partners in the opium trade. But the big thing is the West Coast, as the country is expanding, West Coast did not have slavery, but there was still a desire to go ahead and exploit labor. So the Chinese ended up taking the jobs that African Americans had under slavery. Now, the Chinese are not the only ones. Irish kind of did that in the New England era for a while too. But there was a right to vote, and so there was ability to improve yourself. For Chinese, that was not the case. So Chinese came. The people who are opposed to it are the working people, of course. This is the development of labor unions in the West Coast. So the politicians decided to get rid of Chinese, then you bring in Japanese. Japanese are too ambitious because they're wealthier as a country than US. So they excluded all Asians. Who do we take? Our nationals. By this point, United States colonized the Philippines. This is why the Filipinos. But people didn't like them either, especially coming over Depression. They stopped it. Then Bracero's program comes in. This is why the Asian story and the Mexican story as immigrants, they converge. As Quintard said, they all kind of come together, right? So Asians, Chinese, and then it's Japanese, Filipinos, and now we have Mexicans. 1924 is we got rid of everybody. No more Asians, period. And not only that, they also got rid of Eastern and Southern Europeans, which is why you didn't see a lot of Eastern and Southern Europeans. So and in fact, yes, Beacon Hill now is an Asian community. Back then, it was a Catholic community. For people they did not want, Rainier Beach is the oldest synagogue because, again, they didn't want Jewish people either. That was a Sephardic Jewish community. So most of the foreign-born whites, as well as non-whites, went to the place they called ghetto. And actually, the earlier term for it was Profanity Hill. Okay, the area that's now Pill Hill, that was Profanity Hill. Okay, so among whites, the foreign-born whites were the poorest of the ethnic groups. And among the people who were poor were initially a lot of Scandinavians, the Swedes and Norwegians, but the Finns and Danes lived in the Central District and Beacon Hill. And again, this is the ghetto back then as it was specified. And this is from a 1920 map. So I'm going to go into the whole thing about walls of separation and focus on the exclusion. In terms of settlement and segregation, we have a street called Occidental. Why is it called Occidental? Because all people of color were supposed to be kept east of Occidental Street. That's why it's called that. And that's the border between Pioneer Square and Chinatown International District. So you guys, here's Occidental Park. So you guys know what it is. Here's an old picture of it. See the Chinese who are in the lower right corner? And their trolley went right past them, and that's the white people on that side. Okay? So in terms of ethnic enclaves, I'm going to go ahead and address them because people usually say things about ethnic enclaves in a very negative manner, and it's understandably so. As Quintard mentioned, it's redlining, it's restrictive covenants, and very common after 1926. Invalidated after 1968, but in fact, it was still going on. I think it was under Governor Gregoire. She's the one that finally just banned all restrictive covenants. So historically, immigrant groups were not allowed anywhere, and they're created. And because of that, and they were picked on, people created organizations, including church, to support one another. So this is why we have ethnic markets and all these things. So ethnic enclaves are the places people found jobs. They can get resource support ethnic groups. In fact, UW, I'm teaching here now, we oftentimes say that people who join the ethnic clubs are not the people from South Seattle. We just go home and find each other. It's the people who came from white communities out of the state. They have to find support. Why? Do people intentionally discriminate? It doesn't matter. It's how do you cope with the microaggressions and everything else that we all see. So nowadays we say there's a return to the ethnic community. And just to let you guys know, Beacon Hill was named by Sunset Magazine's Best Neighborhood on the West Coast 2 years ago. So this is the return. Diversity is appreciated more. A lot of us would like to stay, but as Clint already mentioned, people are being forced out. So let me go ahead and show you, these are Seattle's ethnic enclaves. The darker colors means more people of color. So definitely, guys, it's South. 98118 South Beacon Hill and Rainier Beach, most diverse community for 30 years in the United States. And we used to call it the Ship Canal Divide, the I-90 Lid Divide is what we say now. Okay, this is the area that's 98118. And a lot of things change. Let me go ahead and say it's politics, economics, and social, especially the civil rights movement. And what about the politics? The main thing is all the major wars we had after World War II were in Asia, still are. Wow. They're all in Asia. And this is why you can get a lot of refugees from the Asian areas. So Immigration Act, it's now 20,000 per country, no more than 170,000 either hemisphere. And then for all the countries like England afterwards didn't really need to come over, same with France, we had a 7 preference system. And the preferences for all those unfilled spots, we pool it together based upon your relationship to people already in the United States. That's a sponsorship that's all being debated right now that people want to get rid of. Majority of people of color, immigrants, come over this way, okay? And just to let you know, the Brother and Sister Act, at least among the Asians, people are actually have more human capital there than they do coming from the H-1B visa, okay? But anyway, why did it increase the population so much? War brides, because again, there's so many. Longtime residents sponsoring others, Hawaii becomes a state, and international students in particular. You guys can see the lower corner, the countries on top, that make up half of all of the countries that are international students. Even Canada, there's a lot of Asian Canadians. And in the bottom half, there's still a lot of other Asian countries. People are competing internationally. India and China's got a lot of people. We're gonna have some pretty good people out of that, right? So they dominate. So what happens in the upshot of all this? International students sponsor their people. Longtime residents sponsor their people. This is how communities work now. Chinatown International District, again, there are a lot of poor people. Asia back then was pretty poor. And I want to correct something. A lot of people say the old immigrants from China are really poor, poorest of China. No, Cantonese, Guangzhou is the wealthiest part of China, always has been, still is, okay? Anyway, you go in there because the country's poor, that's different. Then they go to Beacon Hill, the Italian neighborhood, the Catholic neighborhood. And you guys know Italian neighborhoods are always next to Chinatowns in most major cities. Italian neighborhood in Seattle is Columbia City. So Beacon Hill, Seattle is where people went. In San Francisco, Richmond, Sunset District, and Brooklyn, Queens, Flushing, in New York. But people can't afford it. We don't call these next places suburbs, we call them outer city. These are unincorporated areas outside of Seattle. So White Center between Burien and West Seattle. Skyway between Renton and Seattle. Tacoma, especially South Tacoma Way, is where you have the most people of color. Federal Way wasn't even a city when I was young, right? Who calls their city Federal Way and SeaTac? Okay, that's a federal portion of Pacific Highway South, but it ends up becoming the 7th largest city in the Seattle area now. Meanwhile, you have these new international students converting their visas. They live in college towns as researchers. Or else they go to science towns. This is why he talked about Bellevue and Newcastle and so forth. But even Newcastle on the east side, the largest of the communities on the east side, that's unincorporated Renton, Bellevue. That's why Newcastle, where Newport High School is, that's the largest of the Asian American community. And then you also have Shoreline, right? Same thing, unincorporated areas. So then people started going elsewhere because in New York, a lot of people go to Brooklyn, Queens, Flushing. Then you go to Jersey. There's San Fernando Valley, San Bernardino, Monterey Park. And I could talk more about this, but no time. So the main thing is, I also want to mention some of the venerable institutions we have. And again, segregation, when it was forced, is bad. But now we say, you need to go to these places to get some help, especially you knew. And actually, guys, studies by Ivan Light and Stephen Goh show Asian Americans who come from ethnic enclaves graduate from college more than the people outside, even though they may be poor, because of the support. So here's Chinese Southern Baptist Church in 1902. It became really popular, and now Chinese Baptist Church, a bigger one, is in Beacon Hill, over on Juneau. This is Blaine United Methodist, and all these are Pan-Asian, okay? So 1904, Blaine United Methodist Church, you guys know the Shintoist design, so that started off as Japanese American. There's also Immaculate Conception in 1904. All these places, what they have is Ilocano services, Cantonese services, Mandarin services, Japanese services, and this is part of the reason why it's not always because people don't like each other, don't want to mix, but you need some help. Okay, so anyway, I think that took enough time, so I'm going to stop right there. Thank you. Okay.
I've been asked to speak about Ephesus in the first century Mediterranean world. Ephesus was a city of 250,000 people and famous for its great temple of Artemis, which was one of the wonders of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Also was like a great banking center for Ephesus, which gave Ephesus a tremendous prestige in the Roman world at that time. And in the first century, St. Paul came to Ephesus. He was first in Corinth. He was there for 2 years, and then he came down to Ephesus and was there actually for 3 years. And his 3 years at Ephesus are very important in the light of what happens to that city and the church that he finds in that city. When he comes, he plays the role of being a teacher. And so he teaches. He finds a building that he can rent called Tyrannus Hall. They've still not been able to find out where that Tyrannus Hall is in the archaeology sites of Ephesus. But he found that hall, was able to rent it. In fact, we even have a footnote in one of the ancient manuscripts that says he rented it from 11 o'clock in the morning until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which is very interesting because for citizens, Roman citizens that would be there, that would be probably the least desirable time to have a lecture or have teaching especially in the heat, in the summer heat. But for the slave population in Ephesus, it would be a time when they could be away from work. They could be away from, because most of the slaves in Ephesus they weren't like in Corinth where they were mainly laborers. The slaves that were in Ephesus were mainly teachers themselves, teachers of youth, or working in households in the city. And so they would be free to come to hear Paul lecture. And what we know is about Paul that he had a tremendous affection for slaves. And they evidently resonated with him as well. We find out from his imprisonments that he had a great relationship with guards. And in several of his letters, he mentions the guards who send their greeting as well. But the slaves at Ephesus became a major part of that Ephesus church. You might say the theology that Paul mainly features in Ephesus, and if you look at the Ephesian letter, its main theological theme is the love of Christ, and the fact that love of Christ is universally relevant. And Paul especially features that point in his preaching in Ephesus. And we see it, for instance, when he writes a letter, because after he was in Ephesus for 3 years, he then goes down to Jerusalem, is then imprisoned in Jerusalem and sent by ship to Rome, where he then ends his career in Rome. And from Rome, he writes a letter to Ephesus, and that letter is what we call the Ephesian letter. So in that letter, he's reminding them of the things that he taught them when he was there. And it's interesting that you might say all of Paul's teaching in the Ephesian letter seems like a Pauline commentary on the greatest commandment. In Matthew 22, Jesus Christ, in one very important occasion, was being challenged by a member of the Pharisee party because he had just won an argument with the Sadducees, and this young Pharisee lawyer comes up to Jesus and questions him and says, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" And probably wondering if he would favor one of the Pharisees' favorite commands of the 10 Commandments versus the Sadducees, who were in the high priesthood. And so Jesus answers him and says, "You shall love the Lord." He doesn't answer the question. He doesn't pick a favorite of the 10 Commandments. But he says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind." This is really quoting from the book of Deuteronomy. "This is the greatest of the commands. And the second is like it." And then now he quotes from Leviticus. "The second is like the first. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Notice it includes the fact that the command is honoring the importance you have for your own life, but your neighbor is seen equal to you. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then our Lord adds one more sentence to this great quotation. "On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets." And if you want to understand what Paul does in his Ephesian teaching, it is basically a commentary on that final statement of our Lord, that on these 2, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and your mind, your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commands, the commandment to love, and then now St. Paul is going to explain how profound that love is. He's talking about the love of God. That is the great love which we are to love him, but his love is for us. And then we're to love the neighbor as ourselves. And so in a way, in the Ephesian letter, it's this sense of the neighbor being brought in and being welcomed in is fundamental to his teaching. Chapter 3, verse 13, he says, "Now in Jesus Christ who were once far off have now been brought near by the blood of Christ," by the concrete life of our Lord and the concrete sacrifice of our Lord at Mount Calvary in our behalf, on behalf of all the world. Christ died for the world. And so that's the reference to the blood, the concrete sacrifice of Christ in our behalf. And he says, "For he is our peace." And this great word from the Old Testament is the word for wholeness. He is the one who fulfills and gives wholeness to our life. And in his flesh, he has made both groups. The groups in this particular context, Paul is trying to relate to Jews and Gentiles, because he is himself Jewish, and then the Gentiles are the people he's mainly talking to they're the Greeks in Ephesus. And he says that you should become one, you should be reconciled, both groups reconciled in one body through the cross, thus putting to death that hostility that we have toward each other. So he recognizes there is hostility. He recognizes there is tension. There is tribalism already at play. That is his teaching. You might say that it's not, I don't want to see it as an oversimplification, but really that is the fundamental teaching of the whole book of Ephesians. In fact, the book of Ephesians is unlike all the other letters because it has such a large quantity of it that it amounts to his prayer for them. In fact, at this very point, he breaks into a prayer. "For this reason, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in the heaven and on earth takes its name. I pray that according to the riches of his glory, he may grant you to be strengthened in your inner being with power through his Spirit, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith." And now listen to this. "And that you, being rooted and grounded in," and now comes the big word for Paul, and the big word is in our Lord's greatest command, "that you may be rooted and grounded in love. I pray that you may have the power to comprehend, to understand with all the saints what is the breadth, length, height, and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses all knowledge, and that you may be filled with the fullness," and there you have that peace word, the fulfillment of God. Now, there you see, that is really his message. He preaches it. He has really great success. We know that from the book of Acts. People came in large numbers. But then opposition grew up because silversmiths who made shrines, famous shrines of Artemis, that they sold because the temple of Artemis was in Ephesus, and so people would come as pilgrimages to buy shrines. And then these shrine makers were losing business because that's simply stated pure and simple in the book of Acts. And so they were protesting. And a great number of them went to the huge amphitheater, which seats 23,000 people. By the way, it still stands today, able to seat 23,000 people. And they went into the amphitheater, and now you have an interesting thing that happens. At one point, one of the Christians that's in Paul's group, a man named Alexander, wants to go out and speak to the crowd. And so he gets permission to go out and speak to this crowd to defend the fact that these people, many of them, become believers. And he stands to speak, and then the crowd recognizes him and says, "He's Jewish." See, it's interesting. The Christians were considered a Jewish sect. They're Jewish, and that then causes the riot. The riot at Corinth starts because of he's not in our tribe. He's out of our tribe. And so Alexander, by the way, an interesting irony happens there. Paul says, "Let me go and speak to the crowd." And the other Christians said, "No, we're not going to." They were very wise. They said, "No, Paul, we've got one Jew up there and we got in trouble. We're not going to get in more trouble." And then the people for 2 hours shout, "Great is Artemis, goddess of the Ephesians." And then the city clerk of the city gets up and quiets the mob. And he quiets them in an interesting secular way. He says, "You'd better be quiet, because if the Romans hear that a riot has broken out in Ephesus, they will come here. And that means they'll take away that free city standard that Ephesus perhaps had." And so that quiets the crowd. Then Paul leaves and goes to Jerusalem, and it makes another trip to Corinth and all, and then goes on his way to Jerusalem. And then there's a second episode that I want to just end with. As he leaves and is traveling now on the ship with Luke and others, they stop in Miletus. Miletus is a little town, maybe an hour or so, 2 hours south of Ephesus. And to show you how loved Paul was by that church, these elders come down to Miletus to meet with Paul. And that meeting that Paul has is in Acts 20. It's quite a remarkable meeting, because he has now been with them 3 years. He's been their teacher. He's gone, and he's also written 2 letters to Corinth. And he, by the way, wrote those letters from Ephesus. So he went and visited the Corinthians again. He's going now back to Jerusalem. He'll end up in Rome, where he'll write his letter to the Ephesians. But he's on his way, and these elders meet with him. And here's what Paul says to them. He says, he begins to warn them and says, "I want you to be alert, because some from your own group will come and will distort the truth in order to entice disciples to follow them." You know, the Christian church has always had problem with error, and error in the church. There are errors outside the church, but there are errors within the church. And it's just interesting. You be careful, because be alert, because they will distort. And by the way, the word for distort that he uses is they will mishandle the truth. They'll mishandle it, or that's also the word for bend. They'll bend the truth. And they'll pick things that maybe they like, and they'll entice you then, and so that you'll want to follow them, because they'll pick things that you want, like maybe they'll have a policy, or maybe even a political policy, or maybe a religious policy, or something that you like, but it will lead them astray. And it's interesting, that astrayness that I think Paul's most worried about is tribalism. He's worried he showed that in Ephesus, that this dividing wall of partition. I didn't read that part, but Sunday, James McDonald, our pastor from Damascus Church, preached here and did a beautiful presentation of that chapter 3 of Ephesians, where Paul says that dividing wall has been broken down. The barrier has been broken down. There is no wall to be built with you. As a matter of fact, the wall that was built in the Jewish synagogue was to keep Gentiles out of a certain place. And it's interesting, isn't it, that when Christ died on the cross, we're told that the veil of the temple, which was the main block of anybody that was not properly agreed upon, that veil was ripped from top to bottom. And so maybe that's what Paul is referring to too. That veil, that boundary has been broken down. And that would be the thing that he would be most worried about, that a kind of tribalism would sneak in to the church. And people would be, we're this or we're that. We're going to follow this group or follow that group. And then we're now, and he is saying, you're going adrift. You're going, you're getting into error. And he ends that by saying, beware of that. I want to alert you about that. And then has this wonderful sort of benediction to him. He says, and now I commend you to God and to the message, the truth of his grace. Now it's again that grace teaching, that love teaching, which was dominant in Ephesus, is now on Paul's mind when he's meeting with the elders. and that I want to commend you to God and to the message of his grace, a message that's able to build you up and give you inheritance, give you your destiny. And the destiny you'll get is not by dividing yourselves up in tribes, but learning how to see that in Jesus Christ you get an identity that is both neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free. That's when Paul describes it. He describes it that way too, because so many slaves in Ephesus became believers. And so Paul says neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, neither Jew nor Greek. It's a new fellowship that is the great truth, and he wants that truth. That's the neighbor. That's the neighbor that you have to love. And it's interesting. Paul agrees with our Lord on these two, to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. On these two hang all the doctrines. So be careful. Someone says, well, I've got a special doctrine with regard to my specialty. I've got a doctrine with regard to my special interest, our tribal interest. If it can't muster agreement with the great command, and then the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. If it can't pass that muster, it's going to have trouble with St. Paul. And St. Paul, I love that he ends that with that note with those folks there at Ephesus.
Well, what a wonderful job you've done of taking us through these experiences. And I'd like to come back to something you said and pose one question, and then we'll get to the cookies. Something you said, Professor Taylor, at the beginning, which was the dynamism of this interaction. You know, we've sort of perpetuated the silos in a way by focusing on these different lenses and these different communities. But in fact, there was a dynamism in Seattle, and just as in Ephesus. And so I'm wondering if you could comment about the benefits of the community experience that came from being in these different sectors within Seattle. Whether we think of it as breaking down the walls of separation, and you did such a great job of explaining Paul's approach to bringing those groups together. Were there, in our own experience in Seattle, benefits from these communities as well as the separation, the liabilities of the separation?
You addressed that more now. You want to try that?
You want me? Oh, that's why I have my credit. Sorry about that. Actually, Seattle is also known in the 98118 for having the most integrated families. So we are the out marriage capital as well in 98118. And I don't, not that I think that everyone needs to out marry to prove that this thing, I think, again, people should love people as individuals regardless. But one thing, Kindred and I both were on this documentary from the Senior Service Center in the Central District. And one thing that a lot of the African-American families, the people we interviewed, they kept saying was, when they watch the Japanese Americans get incarcerated during elementary school, many of the African-American students, their classmates, who may not have talked to each other much because there was a lot of ignorance on both sides by families and so forth, they started crying. And many people have said that's why in Seattle, we really don't have racial gang fights the way many other big cities do. Part of that is because in 98144, which is and we call it Atlantic Street Center, the Jackson Street Brigade and so forth, because Central District and Chinatown International District, they all have these streets in common. But people also found, back in the old days, when they started having parades, they didn't have a seafarer really that included people of color. The African-American community, the Japanese-American, the Chinese-American, Filipino-American, the three big ones at that time, they all got together and they made their own princesses. And they also created Atlantic Street Center as support group for the larger group. And a lot of people also said that even though our parents may understand, after a while, parents see the kids playing with each other. And even though maybe people didn't want people intermarrying, you guys know 1967 was when interracial marriage was finally allowed in the United States. But Seattle, Washington State actually never had a law against that.
Right.
Okay, and one thing we saw is that one of the first couples If we were to do the Filipino American experience, it was an African American who was stationed over in the Philippines. He's the one that taught Filipino history to the Philippines people because that wasn't allowed under U.S. colonization, the Philippines. And their descendants, the Jenkins family, they're still around. And I have their grandchildren in our classes and so forth. And we all say that's because in Seattle, living near each other in a natural way, not because you're really forcing people, but because people, when you start talking naturally, you get rid of those walls, those barriers.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with, a lot of people say that we should be colorblind. I always tell people, you don't have to be colorblind. I see color, I see my color, his color, all the other colors. But I don't prioritize one as better than another. Because I recognize that in history, people have been treated differently. And when people say they don't see my color, my presence, I feel like you're ignoring. There's nothing wrong with the way I look. There's nothing wrong with the way he looks or anybody else. And so we always say in American Ethnic Study, nothing wrong with seeing people. We should see people. Don't want to make it look like it's embarrassing to be colored. But what we should do is not put priority, value over one over another. And we always say true multicultural happens when it's not so forced. Maybe we need a little nudging here and there. But again, if you really force it, people don't want to do it. And again, everyone has something good to offer. It's not going to be the same for everyone else. You have to figure out what makes sense. And I didn't get a chance to talk about Korean Americans, but I would say that most Korean Americans down to 1980 were Buddhist. But because the first people who came from Korea to the United States were the Christians, and that's because they weren't being terrorized by the Japanese who colonized Korea. They started the Methodist Church and Presbyterian Church in Hawaii as well as Los Angeles. But one thing happened is when subsequent Korean groups came, they wanted help support. They went to the Methodist Church, the Korean Methodist Church, the Korean Presbyterian Church. And through this, again, they're still proud about being Korean. No one's going to put down being Korean. People can integrate things. But at the same time, you learn about the Word of God, and you can go ahead naturally, unforced, decide that this is what you want to be, a community you want to be part of, and to see that you don't have to get rid of everything else to become part of this community, this sharing. And again, the people I know who have intermarried, I don't think they've gone exclusively white or exclusively black or exclusively Japanese or anything else. Most people, all households, you have to figure out what makes sense in your family, in my family. We all work to integrate different cultural values, no matter what race, ethnicity people are.
Wow.
Well, thank you to our panel. This was a wonderful walk through a lot of history that I'm sure most of us didn't really appreciate. And our goal really is to merge our history going forward, but on the basis of a real understanding of what's happened in the past. So the second part of our program, as I said, will be drilling down into the experiences of particular people in our congregations who can remember back to some of the things that you've talked about, and live through that experience. So grab a cookie and let's take a 5-minute break.
Grab a cookie.
It'll be a race, and let's return back here.